Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. In a couple of my recent videos, I've been talking about rereading. One was my response to Roz's tag over at Scallydandling about the books, and the other was my discussion of a variety of translations of the opening words of the Odyssey, a video in honor of Steve Donahue's tradition of rereading Homer's text every August. Today, I want to talk about two books published in 2020, both specifically about rereading. The first book is Austen Years, a memoir in 5 novels by Rachel Cohen. When Cohen was young, she thought the novels of Jane Austen were frothy coming-of-age stories. Quote, "I thought of Austen as a writer for the young woman I had been," she writes in Austen Years. But as she matured, she turned back to Austen and found something entirely different. As she says, Austen's subject is not women embroidering on sofas, but life with other people. At a period in her life when Cohen was grappling with significant changes in her own life with other people, she turned again and again to the novels of Jane Austen as a kind of reflective glass to help her make sense of the commitment to domestic partnership, the experience of motherhood, her shifting relationship with her sister, her connection to her father, and the grief she felt after his death. Over those years, she dipped into Austen Years constantly, reading them, as she says, like a map. Although Cohen might have been seeking distraction when she first picked up an Austen novel as an adult, she quickly understood that the comfort Austen provided was not distraction, but deep engagement with issues of grief and emotional commitment. Cohen's personal experiences and preoccupations, what she calls her pronounced personal point of view, allowed her to see themes in Austen which readers have often assumed Austen elided. Criticism and memoir have always been near neighbors, the author points out. And Austen Years straddles the property line between the two neighbors brilliantly. Austen Years pairs each of the novels Cohen discusses with one of the major themes that runs through the author's life. The chapters discussing Sense and Sensibility are especially powerful. As she reads, Cohen realizes that Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood are deeply grieving the death of their beloved Mr. Dashwood, just as she and her sister had been mourning the death of their father. As Cohen reads and rereads Austen's novel, a novel she had earlier interpreted primarily as a romantic comedy that didn't quite work, she begins to understand that the sisters' acute grief is essential to the novel. Austen's characters lose their father and their home and have those losses underlined when they're abandoned by men they thought were in love with them. All the main characters have a tendency to plunge suddenly and surprisingly low, writes Cohen. The intensity of their emotions speak to the absence that dizzies them, unsettling the very ground beneath their feet. The author argues that although the book is not usually described as a novel about grief, the sisters' mourning is a shadow hovering throughout the novel. Just as the Dashwood sisters judge each other's way of grieving, Cohen recognizes that she and her own sister mourn their father in different ways. Both are endangered by the division, she writes. Cohen points out that Austen's novels often end not with the marriage of two characters, but with a private moment where the two people take a walk together. Emma takes a turn around the garden with Mr. Knightley, while Elizabeth strolls with Darcy. At the end of Sense and Sensibility, the resolution happens instead when Eleanor and Marianne come together for a walk and set off on their own path of resolution. Threaded through Austen Years is a series of similar reconciling walks, many around Fresh Pond, a spot of calm near Cohen's home, where the author returns to regularly, circling around it just as she cycles through Austen's books throughout these years. Cohen is not the only person to write about the personal experience of reading Jane Austen. She's attentive to the work of other literary discussions of Austen's novels, including essays by authors from Virginia Woolf to Azar Nafisi to Ta-Nehisi Coates. She finds their work exciting and inspiring, After I had learned more of what Austen had meant and meant to others, she writes, I saw more of who I had been reading her pages. I think Austen years will appeal to lovers of Jane Austen, maybe those of you who participated in Jane Austen July, as well as to those interested in memoirs about grief and mourning, and of course to all who recognize the companionship of literature. I was completely entranced by this graceful and deeply introspective book. The second book I want to mention today is Vivian Gornick's Unfinished Business, Notes of a Chronic Rereader. She begins her book by pointing out that rereading old favorites is often quite a bit like lying on a psychiatrist's couch. Written by a critic who has been active in journalism circles since the early days of the feminist movement, Unfinished Business is an elegant and slim memoir of her lifetime of reading. Growing up, Gornick knew that meaningful books provided what she calls courage for life, as well as a kind of companionedness, the combination of which gave her both peace and excitement. As she rereads those old favorite books, she begins to recognize that often when she picks one up, quote, the narrative I have had in my heart for years is suddenly being called into alarming question. Gornick realizes that her ideas about books shift and change as she herself shifts and changes. Unfinished Business is her attempt to trace that process through a handful of books that have meant a great deal to her over the years, from D.H. Lawrence to Elizabeth Bowen, from Colette's work to that of Doris Lessing. Gornick's experiences of re-engaging with favorite books are often shaped by her feminism. She realizes that her experiences, from sexual exploration to relationships, from her childhood to her career, are not just personal but also political. That understanding underlines much of the close reading and analysis of the text she finds herself reading and rereading. When she was young, Gornick's initial understanding of feminism led her to believe that a life oriented around sexual passion was a kind of liberation. Over time, the ideas of sexual love as freedom begins to seem to her like mere illusion. She comes to believe that people often use desire to avoid rather than to eliminate. Neither sexuality nor romantic relationship lies at the heart of any human's core identity, she argues. In response to that realization, Gornick begins to search instead for narratives that, for example, cast women at the heart of the story instead of making them mere foils for their lovers. She's also intrigued by books that consider how men choose or fail to choose actions that move their own narratives forward. One of my favorite essays in Gornick's book is her thoughtful exploration of her changing interpretation of J.L. Carr's A Month in the Country. In the foreword to his short novel, Carr states that he initially intended to write a rural idyll about an event in his life. As he wrote, however, a darker landscape emerged of Britain struggling with the aftermath of the First World War. When Gornick first read Carr's quiet book, she embraced the idea of a young soldier making a fresh start after his return from war. When she picks the book up years later, she's struck by the main character's desire to, quote, not be a casualty anymore. He's found what he hoped would be a path to healing from the shocks of battle, but the peace he sometimes experiences at his work does not lead to human connection or to purpose. The book ends not with a clean slate, but with, as Gornick writes, melancholy thick enough to cut with a knife. The trauma of war has utterly stunted the spiritual growth of the novel's main character. That is, pain has stunted his ability to act. Gornick understands this fact only when she begins to conceive of a more nuanced meaning of liberation. In the lovely final chapter, Gornick recounts the experience of coming across a long, unread mass-market paperback on her shelves, a book published in the 1970s. When she picks it up, the volume immediately begins to fall apart in her hands. She starts to reassemble the loose pages, quote, lying all about on my lap, on the desk, on the floor, and is puzzled when she catches sight of a sentence, as she says, she must have underlined some 40 years ago. Then she sees a paragraph she's encircled, and then a set of matching exclamation points off in the margin. She considers the sentences. Why do you underline this? I ask myself. What's so interesting here? Then again, look at this one. You've also underlined. How obvious. What were you thinking? When she glances at the next page, she's struck by an insight printed there. Yet none of her markings show up there. She thinks to herself, now here's something really interesting. How come this didn't attract your attention? It isn't that her initial reading was too immature or too limited. It's that she's now asking new questions. Some of those questions may have even arisen because of what she learned on a previous reading of the book. Or perhaps the world has changed enough that the author is suddenly speaking to a world he or she knew nothing about, but nevertheless had something to say to. Anyway, she begins to read anew, underlining and encircling in a pen of another color the sentences and passages that now struck her as worth noting. After she finishes, Gornick places the pages away, carefully bound together now with a rubber band, awaiting another rereading. A rereading she will do with a pen of yet another color in hand. Her new understandings will join the old on the pages of the books on her shelves, creating proof that each text always remains alive to the attentive rereader. Reading a book, in other words, is always an unfinished business. All in all, both Austen Years and Unfinished Business were books I very much enjoyed. Neither's perfect, but I definitely especially recommend both to anyone who's been caught up by the fascinating questions that Roz's rereading tag put before us. And now I'm off to do some more rereading. Last month I reread Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, and also read a new book about Faulkner, and I hope to talk about those books in a few days. And this month, I'm rereading a lot of Shakespeare and talking with my son about much of it, as well as reading a few new-to-me books about Shakespeare. All of that will be coming up soon on this channel. And there are some other books as well, totally unrelated to the theme, that will be popping up too. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.